We have two more classes, I believe, before our studies are up. I may have miscounted that, but I think that's right. No, we have 3 tonight and 2 more. So we have plenty of time to explore this further. And the part of the study that we're in is the reflection of God's love. We've been making our way around this circle to complete love, to get to perfected love. And the last part of it is reflecting the love, which has to do with all the different relationships that make up our lives. The first part of that has been about loving God, and we spent 2 weeks on that. Will started us with that, and then I finished it up last week on the order of your loves. And so tonight we're moving to a different relationship. This is a very challenging one. Tonight I want to talk about loving your enemies. So this is going to be a study that, will be challenging, will be difficult. And it goes back to the Sermon on the Mount. If you have your Bibles, which I hope you do, turn to Matthew chapter 5. We're going to be looking at verses 38 to the end of the chapter. And you'll remember in Matthew 5, Jesus has a pattern to his teaching where he says, you've heard that it was said, and then he'll quote not necessarily the law of Moses, but the tradition of the elders according to that law, or the way they interpret that law. And so that begins this block of teaching on loving enemies in Matthew 5, verse 38. And this is what he says on the right side of the screen. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, none of the rabbis and teachers disagreed that the book of Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18 said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But they redefined neighbor, or they gave neighbor a strict definition to exclude certain individuals they didn't want to love. And this is what you can see Jesus subtly attacking in the Sermon on the Mount. You'll see they redefined a couple of things when you lay Leviticus 19:18 beside Matthew 5:43, which represents the tradition. One thing that's missing is the phrase, as yourself. You've heard that it has been said, you shall love your neighbor. Where's the rest of that? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So by doing that, they limited the love that was needed. Loving your neighbor is one thing. Loving your neighbor as much as you love yourself, well, that's a far broader concept, right? So that was the first way they limited the instruction. And the second one, of course, is that they excluded the enemy from the definition of the term neighbor. Leviticus 19:18 doesn't say, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but they were teaching this as, love your neighbor does not include loving your enemy. And so Jesus sets up a contrast. They say, love your neighbor, hate your enemy, but Jesus says, love your enemy. Now, we need to ask ourselves who our enemies are. Who is your enemy? Do you have any opponents? Now, some people say they don't have any enemies. They don't think they do. Some people joke that they're so old they've outlived all their enemies. I don't see anybody in that category here tonight. Other people don't think of themselves as the kind of people that have enemies. Oscar Wilde once said this of George Bernard Shaw, that he was an excellent man and has no enemies, but then he said, and none of his friends like him. So maybe that's what you're like. You don't have any enemies, but your friends don't like you. Sometimes we don't like that word enemy and we don't apply it where it should apply. But if you have convictions, if you stand for something, you have enemies. A man with no enemies has never taken a stand on anything. The moment you stand up for something, you automatically create a whole set of enemies. So think about that. Who are they? Put a face to the enemies and picture them in your mind. It's very important that you think of this. Think of your personal enemies. We tend, when we look at this verse, to think of like maybe political enemies. Right now, probably the Taliban would come to mind. Or we think of religious enemies, maybe false teachers or other religions other than Christianity, other denominations, or we might think of ideologies we don't agree with, the pro-abortion platform, for example, or evolutionary biologists, or other political ideologies like that. But I want you to think about your personal enemies, because that's what makes this very challenging. I heard one time that when he was running for president, Andrew Jackson was asked to sit down with a minister who was going to evaluate his faith. Because back then, running for president, you needed to be considered a faithful Christian. And Jackson had been in a lot of conflicts. He'd seen a lot of war. And he was a controversial subject then. He'd been in some feuds. He'd been in some duels. He'd killed people. And so they really wanted to interview him and see what he was like and where his faith was. And one of the minister evaluating him asked him, "Can you forgive all your enemies?" And he had to think about that for a while. And after a moment of silence, he said, "My political enemies I can freely forgive. But as for those who abused me when I was serving my country in the field, and those who attacked me for serving my country, and those who slandered my wife, that's a different case." He answered it honestly. So the minister told him that no one who fully harbors ill will toward his enemies can be evaluated as having a credible faith. And eventually Jackson said he would try to forgive his enemies. But the record doesn't tell us if he ever actually did. You see, what happened there is what happens to a lot of us. We're fine with loving our enemies until we're able to put a face on the enemy, someone that we've actually had dealings with. And when it gets personal like that, this subject gets really, really hard. So we need to picture our enemies in order to understand what Jesus is saying here. Now, verse 48, the end of this. Let's start with the conclusion. He says, "You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." Now, some people look at perfect here as sinlessly perfect. And of course, God in heaven is without sin. And so we can say that of God, but can we say that Jesus really intends that meaning here in the Sermon on the Mount? Does he really think that any of us can lead a sinless life? I'm going to say no, because of some things that he's already said. For example, in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, verse 6, he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled." You don't hunger for righteousness if you already fully have it. And so he's extending that blessing upon those struggling with achieving the righteousness of God, knowing full well that without his blood, they're unable to have that righteousness. They have to be by grace made righteous. Later on, he would teach this same crowd in the next chapter. When he's giving the model prayer in chapter 6, he would teach them to pray, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." And he talks very plainly about the sin that his disciples will struggle with and how to deal with it. So he doesn't mean here at the end of this chapter that we are going to find perfect holiness. We need to read it in the context, and the context here is that of love, the perfect love of the Father. And this goes along with what we've been talking about in this class, that John in 1 John 4, 17 and 18 talked about perfect love, complete love, love that comes full circle back around to God, love for its own sake. And when we have that, we have full confidence, full boldness. And that's what Jesus is talking about here, is we should love the way the Father loves. Now, seeing that, we ask this question: what does loving our enemies entail? And you can break the text down into two parts. And here's what it entails. Number one, passive non-resistance. And number two, active love. Passive non-resistance and active love. There's a part of it that involves restraint and a part of it that involves action. So let's start with the passive non-resistance, and this is Matthew 5, verses 38 through 42. Let's read that section together. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. See the passive non-resistance? Do not resist. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. So there's the first part of loving your enemies, passively restraining your natural inclination to seek revenge or to fight back, defend yourself, resist. Now, part of this is acknowledging that you are not always going to be in control of the situation. He is listing 4 examples here of situations common to the people of his day in which they have no control and they want to fight back, but fighting back would really be futile. It would be unwise in their case. The first one, verse 39, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now, I know we all think about somebody just walking up after an argument and popping us on the cheek, but he's probably referring to an official slap of the cheek, a backhand of insult that was used a lot of times by officials interrogating prisoners. Jesus got that kind of treatment in his trials. You can see it firsthand in the Gospels. And the disciples, or Paul, I think, received a backhand one time, and he got really angry about that, but he didn't hit him back. So this is something that would happen in the courts of law all the time. Can you imagine that happening today? You know, it'd be crazy. There'd be all kinds of lawsuits. But in those days, the Jewish people who got themselves into this situation in the courts, they really had no recourse. They needed to restrain themselves. And you imagine somebody slapping you in the face. That's an automatic, you go to the enemy category, right? I mean, you slap me in the face, you might have been my friend before the slap, but you're going to be an enemy. So that qualifies. The second illustration, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Now, we don't really get sued for our clothes so much. We might have an expression, he took the shirt off my back or something like that, but we can still be sued through no fault of our own in this country. This is a pretty common thing. In fact, of all the examples he gives, this is probably the most common injustice that Americans suffer. People are suing one another all the time, illegitimately. And you have to put yourself at the mercy of the courts of law. And it's a very difficult thing. It gets even trickier when brethren sue one another. And Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 6, and he's consistent with Jesus here about non-retaliation. So that's difficult. Third illustration, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. There was a law in the books of Rome that if a Roman soldier was carrying his gear and he grew weary of the road trip, he could compel anybody walking on that road to carry his load for a whole mile. You don't even have to be going in the same direction. You might have an appointment. But if that soldier says, you're going to carry my gear for the next mile, you have to go at least a mile with that gear. That's not right. That's an injustice. And Jesus says, don't just go 1 mile, go 2 miles, double it. So adding to the passive non-resistance is a willful helpfulness to the enemy. And then the last illustration, give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. That's something else that's familiar to us today. You know, you have no control over people begging you for money, for food, for help. You don't know when that's going to pop up. And Jesus says, have a giving spirit toward that. Now, there are, of course, people who beg illegitimately and beg for services that they already have, but they don't like the rules. And, you know, in the Birmingham city limits, I know this kind of thing is not legal, and there are shelters set up to help these people. So Jesus doesn't mean for us to get into methods here of how you give and how you help, but rather just the way we're going to respond to this situation, maybe an injustice that's out of our control. What are we going to do in that situation when somebody presents themselves as an enemy in these 4 ways? We're going to return that, not with fighting back or defending ourselves, but with trying to be more helpful than what they ask us for. So what he's saying here at the beginning is, you can't control what happens to you. You can't control other people. You can't fight back and gain your own justice. And so why not show love instead? Very revolutionary idea that he has there. Now, if you've been subjected to injustices like these or others, you're in good company, because you need to understand that everyone suffers wrongs. That's the problem with playing a victim. It works for a little while and people will sympathize, but if you make a lifetime habit of being a victim, people get tired of that, because everybody suffers wrongs. And if you think about it, there are some good reasons for that. It can be helpful to us. Good reasons to have enemies in our lives. Back in the 19th century, they used to ship cod from the North Atlantic to San Francisco by going all the way down south around the South American peninsula. That was the only way they could get over to the Pacific Ocean, the West Coast. And so that presented a problem. The first thing they tried was to pack the cod in ice, but it was a months-long trip, and by the time it got to California, it was ruined. So the next thing that they tried was to keep the cod alive in aquariums or tanks of water, and they lived, most of them, through the trip, but because they weren't getting any exercise, they were tasteless and not very good at all. The quality had really declined in the fish. So somebody had this idea. They said, why don't we put some catfish in with the cod in the fish tanks? And the reason they suggested that is that catfish apparently are the sworn enemy of codfish. They don't like each other. And so the catfish like to eat cod as much as human beings do. So they put a couple of these catfish in the tank, and now the cod have to move around and exercise all the way down south around the South American Peninsula, all the way up to San Francisco, and it worked. When the fish got there, because they were placed with an enemy, they were healthy and fresh and good. And that's just an illustration of what enemies do for our lives. They give us a reason to exercise our faith. There's a good reason why God allows opponents and enemies into our lives. I ran across this prayer that was prayed by a Serbian bishop who was put in a German concentration camp during World War II. He had been speaking against the Nazis, and of course he paid the price for it. And I want to share with you this prayer that he inscribed. He said, "Bless my enemies, O Lord, even I bless them and do not curse them. Enemies have driven me into your embrace more than friends have. Enemies have bound me to earth. Enemies have loosed me from earth friends have bound me to earth. Enemies have loosed me from earth and have demolished all my aspirations in the world. Just as a hunted animal finds safer shelter than an unhunted animal does, so have I, persecuted by enemies, found the safest sanctuary, having ensconced myself beneath your tabernacle, where neither friends or enemies can slay my soul. Bless my enemies, O Lord, even I bless, and do not curse them. He saw this perspective, that enemies help us grow closer to God. And so you're in good company if you have enemies. We all do. And the first instructions here that are given to us from Jesus is, when an enemy strikes, respond with passive non-retaliation. Our inclination is to respond in kind, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus says, don't strike back. Don't take matters into your own hands. Now, to really fully understand this, you've got to understand that Jesus drew a distinction between personal revenge and institutional justice. Okay, those are two different things. If you don't understand that, you may walk away from this thinking God doesn't care about justice. But God is infinitely righteous. He cares about justice. And the reason why we care so much about justice and don't like being treated unfairly is because we've been made in His own image. So our concern for justice is really a reflection of the image of God that we've been made in. But when it comes to us personally, we're not to take matters into our own hands. We're to leave it to the wrath of God. And to illustrate that, I want to go to Romans chapter 12. This is a parallel passage to what we're reading in the Sermon on the Mount. In Romans 12, verse 19, you'll see something very familiar with regard to personal revenge. Beloved, Paul says, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Love is the most powerful force that you have at your disposal when you're out there alone facing injustices. You cannot take down the government alone. You cannot take down your enemies alone. Leave it to the wrath of God. Does that mean God doesn't care? Of course not. Paul continues to write, starting in Romans 13, verse 1, about one of God's systems that He's put in place for bringing justice to the people who've been treated unfairly. It's the government. The government is not perfect because it's run by human beings, but it's called God's servant for punishing the evildoer and rewarding those who are good. And I won't take the time to read that, but it's important that you see that distinction and understand how Romans 12 flows into Romans 13. When it comes to personal revenge, don't take matters into your own hands. Leave it to the wrath of God, which may mean calling the police or using your legal rights or letting the law work on your behalf or waiting for Judgment Day. Your role is to overcome evil with good, showing kindness. And through the kindnesses you show, it's like heaping burning coals of shame on your enemy's head. That's the first thing. Passive non-resistance. Okay, let's go to the second part of this now. Matthew 5:43 through 48. Active love. Here's what Jesus says here. Let's read that together. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For He makes His sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And what he says here is loving your enemies actively is expressing that love through deeds, words, and prayers. Right? Let's look at that, starting with the deeds. And to get those three things, I'm comparing Matthew's account with Luke's. Okay? So if you go over to Luke chapter 6, keeping your finger in Matthew 5, you see slightly different wording there. And here's what he says in verse 27. I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. So what are we to do? We're to do good. He's talking here about practical acts of kindness, just like we read in Paul at the end of Romans chapter 12. That's where Jesus' instructions get very, very challenging, right? I mean, it's one thing to love in your mind, but to actually act on it, that's an entirely different thing. I saw a quote attributed to Dostoevsky which said, love in action is much more terrible than love in dreams. Now, I don't know if there's something lost in translation, or he might actually have meant that it's so hard, it's terrible to actively show love to your enemy. Whereas to think about it and have those fond feelings in your dreams, that's a lot easier to do. And Jesus is the perfect example of this, right? When he died on the cross, he died for his enemies. You may have never thought of yourself as an enemy, but every sin is an act of war against God. And sin separates us from God. When we look at Romans chapter 5, verse 10, it says, while we were enemies, Christ died for the ungodly. Jesus died on the cross for enemies. As long as we were in sin, there wasn't a single friend among us. And that's what reconciliation is for. You don't reconcile people who are friendly with one another. They don't need reconciliation. The language of reconciliation is used about our salvation because we got on the other side, opposite of Christ, to oppose Him with our sin. And so, if we follow in His steps, we're going to take actions of kindness on behalf of our enemies. Those are the deeds. And then the words, still in Luke chapter 6, verse 28 says, bless those who curse you. Those are words. Blessings are pronouncements of good upon people. Now, you can just speak blessings without words and they're hollow. But when a person who acts also speaks words of blessings, they're very meaningful to people. And you have to be careful with your words. Not just the words that you speak, but the words that are bouncing around in your head. You may think as long as you got the tongue under control, you don't have to worry about what's popping around in your head. That is not true, right? Here's how it works. Words shape our thoughts. And our thoughts determine our actions. And so if we've got evil words about people bouncing around in our head, but we're biting our tongue, it's still affecting our thinking. And that negative thinking is going to come out. No doubt about it. And this isn't something I have to prove to you, because it's happened to everybody in this room, right? We've all been alive long enough to have been challenged to harbor evil words and slander and thoughts in our hearts to try to contain it. And then one way or the other, it comes out in unfortunate ways. So words are extremely important. They frame your thinking. They frame your heart. And then there are the prayers, the words we speak to God. This gets us back into Matthew 5, verse 44. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And this is a very powerful thing. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book on the Sermon on the Mount, called this the supreme command. Intercession on behalf of your enemies. That's like putting your arm around your enemy and taking a trip up to God's throne in heaven and standing next to this evil person and saying, Lord, do not hold this man's sin against him. It's like Stephen in Acts 7, who while he was being stoned, saw the Lord Jesus and said, do not hold this against them. And he got that from Jesus, who of course died on the cross, praying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So even seeing those examples, we're challenged by this. But it is the supreme expression of love, prayer on behalf of your enemies. And it's not just an expression, it's a means to an end. Here's how it works. It's hard to hate somebody you're praying for. Try it. Think of somebody that you just can't stand and pray for them. And then see how you feel about them tomorrow. And the more you pray for them, the more your love will warm and grow toward that person. And so loving your enemies comprises these three things: deeds, words, and prayers. Now, we've been seeing a lot in these instructions regarding returns. You know, how you respond, reciprocation, right? And if you're looking at this, you might be saying, well, I see my enemy getting a lot out of this, but what am I getting out of it? And the answer Jesus gives us is, you're getting exactly what your Father in heaven gets. Look at what he says in Matthew 5:45. You love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Children are like their parents. So he's saying, so you'll favor your Father in heaven. This makes you like God. And then he explains that. He makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. Who can argue with that? The whole world gets the same treatment with regard to the sun. And sends rain on the just and on the unjust. Again, you can't argue with that. I like how it's put in Luke 6:35, the parallel passage over there. Love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. So your love is a love that's not expecting anything back. I'll stop right there because I think as a church, a lot of times we struggle with this concept. When we serve our community, you know, I've been guilty of this. You do things and you break your back to try to do something for the community, and then you register people, you get addresses, you contact them, you do follow-up, and nobody comes to visit services. Nobody agrees to have a Bible study. Nobody signs up for Bible correspondence courses. Nobody sends a thank you card. And you start thinking, maybe you thought this before, what are we doing all this work for? Why are we serving all these people who are ungrateful? Well, the reason is love is an end in itself. The goodness is an end in itself. You do it expecting nothing in return. Don't expect it. Don't expect it. He goes on to say, this makes you like God, just like in Matthew. Your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. Now remember, in Matthew's account, it's to the good and to the evil, to the just and to the unjust. He uses two other phrases here of the people, the enemies we help in this. He is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. And I like to go over to Luke 6:35 because of that term ungrateful. Because a lot of times when we show love to others, it's not really evil that we get in return for it or injustice. I don't ever feel like people are hating me or doing an injustice towards me, but I often feel like people are ungrateful. Do you ever feel that way? Ever feel that way about family members? About children, grandchildren? About people that you've bent over backwards, about church members? People you've bent over backwards to help, and they never say thank you. And you think, what am I doing this for? This is supposed to help me. And whenever you stoop to that victimization, that pity party, you're reducing a relationship down to a consumer exchange of goods. I give you something only because I want you to give me something. Now, God doesn't love that way because God doesn't need anything. He owns everything. He's never given anything in an exchange. And so we have to revisit what love is for. And then we can understand loving enemies. Love may not change your enemy. There are a lot of beautiful stories that I could share with you about how enemies of Christ turned around when they saw the love that Christians showed. But 9 times out of 10, there's not a happy ending to that story. The enemy continues to be an enemy, ungrateful and evil. What does God say? Continue to love your enemies so you can be like God. He wants a reflection of Himself in the church. He wants us to complete that circle and to love others as we have been loved. And nothing makes us stand out in the world more than that. So verse 47, if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You know, non-Christians help people who help them. Non-Christians help their friends. Non-Christians love people who will love them back. That's human nature. That's what everybody does. That doesn't make you unique in any way or like Christ in any way. What more are you doing? The Greek word there is perisson. It means extraordinary, unusual, uncommon. What uncommon, extraordinary thing are you doing to set yourself apart from the world? And he's not talking about the biggest video presentation or most sensational worship music or most beautiful facilities or the funniest sermon or program. He's not talking about that. He's talking about Christian love. That's what makes you stand apart. That's the one thing the world will not give itself, is real love, the love of God. Well, somebody might ask if Jesus demands too much here. There's a story about a holy man who's out meditating in the countryside, and he sees a scorpion struggling to get out of a swirling pool of water. So he tries to help the scorpion out, and the scorpion keeps trying to sting him. And a passerby sees him doing that, and he says, "Why are you doing it?" He says, "Don't you realize it's the nature of the scorpion to attack you?" And the holy man said, "Yes, but why should I allow his evil nature to change my nature to do good and to help?" I want to share with you in the last remaining moments some words from Dallas Willard in his book, The Divine Conspiracy. It's on the Sermon on the Mount. Is it then hard to do things with which Jesus illustrates the kingdom heart of love, or the things that Paul says love does? It is very hard indeed if you have not been substantially transformed in the depths of your being, in the intricacies of your thoughts, feelings, assurances, and dispositions, in such a way that you are permeated with love. Once that happens, then it's not hard. He asks, what would be hard is to act the way you acted before. When Jesus hung on the cross and prayed, Father, forgive them because they do not understand what they are doing, that was not hard for him. What would have been hard for him would have been to curse his enemies and spew forth vileness and evil upon everyone, God and the world, as those crucified with him did, at least for a while. He calls us to him to impart himself to us. He does not call us to do what he did, but to be as he was, permeated with love. So is it hard to love your enemies? Only if you have not yet allowed the gospel to transform your heart. And if you're struggling with it, we all struggle, but if it's something that you just feel you cannot ever get around to doing, you need to take a few steps back and revisit whether Christ is in your heart at all. Because I agree with Willard, and this changes my thinking a little bit. I don't think it was hard for Jesus to pray, Father, forgive them, because he was being absolutely true to his nature. Why? 1 John 4:8, God is love. Now, are we like Christ? Only if we love our enemies. Only if we pray for those who persecute us. It's a challenging idea, but we won't start reflecting godly love until we learn it. That's all the time we have for tonight.